Good morning. Barry Bryson joining you again for 5 good minutes in the Word. And we're continuing our conversation about Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, part of our larger conversation about the centurions that we meet. The centurions that we meet in the New Testament are professional men. They are men of faith as well, men who understand authority. And I think we're going to see that with Cornelius today. Cornelius, as we said yesterday, is the most important, the senior centurion in Palestine, because he is stationed in Caesarea, the Roman headquarters in Palestine, and he is of the Italian cohort. In other words, he's commanding the group of soldiers that come from the peninsula, that are from Italy itself. And so these men are almost certainly, I would say certainly, citizens, which not all foot soldiers and not all centurions were. That's why he has a bit of an extensive household. He has servants who are from the economy locally, and he also has servants who are in the military who are attending him in his house. He's sent, at the end of our conversation yesterday, per God's command, 2 servants and a soldier, a devout soldier, to fetch Peter to hear what God has to say. It's not how he's described. He's described as devout. That means someone who is observant, who's very careful about their spiritual life, someone who orders their days around their spiritual life, who lives an orderly life, and whose faith orders their life. He's also called a God-fearer. This is someone who is a believer in the text of the Old Testament, but who is not a Jew. And he's the perfect person to become the first Gentile convert. Peter, of course, comes. We take some time to learn about his experience, and God having to convince him that it's okay to sit at table with a Gentile. We talked about this earlier. We've talked about Peter and Paul, about the whole issue of table fellowship. But anyway, he comes immediately when he's sent for, and goes directly to Cornelius. And when he does, when he meets Cornelius, it says in verse 25 of chapter 10, Cornelius fell at his feet and worshipped him. And Peter says, "Stand up, I too am just a man." People have been uneasy with and doubtful of Cornelius's eagerness to prostrate himself before a Galilean Jew. But in the first place, I don't see this as a calculated posture. I see this as something natural. He understands this man is coming from God. I also know that he's a man like the centurion that we met in Matthew chapter 8, who understands authority and who understands that Peter represents God's authority. When God gave his message to Cornelius, he called him in the way he called Samuel, in the way he spoke to Abraham. It was a very Old Testament moment, firmly establishing that it is actually God who is calling. And when he calls for Cornelius, when God calls for Cornelius to be baptized, he does the same. He gives the New Testament call, because when Peter preaches the gospel to them, before he's even finished and can ask them to be baptized, God sends the Holy Spirit. This is so important, and I know some brethren have an issue with the fact the Holy Spirit was received before baptism, and many in the denominational world want to make a point of that baptism is not necessary for the receiving of the Holy Spirit. This is a singularity, and Peter says so. Later on, he says so in Acts chapter 11. He says so in Acts chapter 15. He says, how can we deny baptism to people who had already received the Holy Spirit? God himself is imprinting his approval on the baptism of this devout, faithful, amazing man, and he is immediately baptized with all of his household, because that's what obedient people do. That's what people of faith do. They are baptized as soon as they know God has asked them to be baptized. And that's why Cornelius is such a wonderful example for all of us. Okay, we're going to conclude our conversation about centurions tomorrow when we're together next by talking about the centurions at the end of the book of Acts who rescue Paul on more than one occasion. Thank you for joining me today for 5 Good Minutes.